Hello everybody and welcome to the first lesson in a series on the subject of Mao's China for Edexcel A-Level History. What we're going to do in this video is take an introduction to the state at which we are coming into this period of history, talking about the establishment of communist rule in China, and we're going to begin by thinking about the condition of China in 1949 as we look to the end of the Civil War. So, the next few lessons are going to think about the following issues. We'll talk about the aftermath of the Civil War, we'll talk about the state of China's industry, agriculture, and national infrastructure, and the kind of Herculean task, if you will, that the Communist Party had in terms of dealing with the reconstruction of China following both the Sino-Japanese Wars and the Chinese Civil War. We'll also do in this lesson a background and overview of the Chinese Civil War, the impact of both the Chinese Civil War and the Second World War on China, and start to think about the condition of China at the point at which we see the aftermath of the Chinese Civil War. And so from the beginning then, we can see that the Chinese Civil War is a pivotal conflict, of course, which ultimately leads to the establishment of the People's Republic of China under the auspices and under the control of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. The aftermath of the war brings about the downfall of the nationalist government, the Kuomintang government, the nationalist, the Chinese Nationalist Party, the KMT, and the rise of communism in China. And so ultimately, we can trace the origins of the Civil War to the unstable political environment that follows the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. We won't go all the way back to 1911 and the Qing dynasty, but ultimately we can see that the downfall of the Qing dynasty brings about the establishment of a nationalist government in China, which in turn has to deal with the impact of partially the First World War, but then more importantly the Second World War and the Sino-Japanese conflict, the invasion of China by Japan. The Chinese Nationalist Party was led at the time by an individual by the name of Chiang Kai-shek, and had an ideology of nationalism and anti-communism, as well as a Western-style modernization set of policies. Initially, the KMT was supported by a number of the urban elites within China, business interests, and also members of the military. The KMT also enjoyed broad support from the United States, which sought to provide financial and military assistance during the war with Japan. And as the United States would start to develop into the Cold War and would start to develop a policy that we call containment, essentially trying to contain communism as much as possible, the idea of a Chinese Communist Party taking over China in 1949 fell against that idea and against that policy. So we will see that the US would naturally support the nationalists not only during the war but also during the Civil War itself. By contrast then, the Chinese Communist Party was led by an individual named Mao Zedong. Mao, who of course we're going to become very familiar with over the course of our series of lessons. Its ideology was a mixture of Marxism, Leninism that would ultimately develop later into the idea of Maoism, an individual, distinct type of Marxist and socialist ideology that's centered around the teachings of Mao. Now, the CCP's main support came from the rural peasantry, who were often quite disillusioned with the KMT's corruption and the failure to address their needs. The communists' policies of land reforms were especially appealing to the rural population. And so after the defeat of the Japanese in 1945, the end of the Second World War, the nationalists under the KMT and the communists under the CCP, both of which had been allies in anti-Japanese resistance, resumed their own rivalry over control of China. And so the war between these factions did not break out immediately, however, due to diplomatic negotiations. So in the immediate post-war period, the immediate period after the Sino-Japanese War, or the Second World War more broadly, we can see that China faced significant internal strife. The KMT had emerged as the recognized government in China, but had been deeply weakened by corruption, inflation, and poor governance. Additionally, the Japanese occupation of China left most of its infrastructure, and more broadly speaking, its economy, in ruins. And so the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, sought to consolidate control over areas that had been previously controlled by the Japanese under occupation. So most particularly and most prevalently the northeast. But in doing so, and in endeavouring to do so, the KMT faced quite strong resistance from communist forces, who had already established control over significant areas of northern China. And the period between 1945 and 1946, we see that the KMT and the CCP enters into negotiations in Chongqing, brokered by the United States under General George Marshall. So the US was trying to broker a deal between these two groups. These talks aimed to try and create a unified post-war government, but tensions remained high, particularly over issues of military control and political power, and these would ultimately end in failure and lead to the resumption of an open conflict in 1946. So that's what we start to see during that period. And so when we get to the Civil War itself, there are generally a few phases of this war. I've sort of divided it into three phases. The initial phase takes place in 1946 to 1947. I should say 1947. It says 1949. I acknowledge that. It begins with heavy fighting in northeast China in the region known as Manchuria. It's a region with strategic importance due to its industrial base. The KMT, the nationalists, after initially having the upper hand, were forced to confront what was a quite well-organized communist force in Manchuria. The Soviets would play a significant role in the early stages of this conflict. So, a fact that a lot of people don't really realise is that after the Second World War is won in Europe and the defeat of the Third Reich, the Soviets turn their attention to the Japanese and declare war on Japan and invade Manchuria in the final days of the Second World War. That same week, of course, in August 1945, we see the dropping of the two atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, respectively, by the US, and ultimately the combination of all of these factors brings the Japanese to unconditional surrender. So after the Japanese defeat in 1945, the Soviet Union take control of Manchuria and start to provide arms and training to the CCP, giving the communists a crucial advantage and allowing them to secure the region between 1946 and 1947. In this initial phase, then, it became immediately clear that the KMT had a number of quite important difficulties, mainly logistical difficulties, and the government's reliance on warlord factions ultimately further undermined its ability to unite the country. The nationalist military would start to struggle with morale and discipline, and by 1947 there were widespread reports of corruption and inefficiency among the ranks of the KMT. Between 1947 and 1946, we see strategic shifts and the strengthening of the CCP under Mao Zedong, signalling their ability to gain the upper hand. So Mao Zedong's forces would use often guerrilla tactics and gain popular support among the peasantry, and the KMT's response, including brutal tactics and the targeting of communist sympathizers, as well as their reliance on inefficient and corrupt administrative structures, meant that the population felt quite alienated by the KMT's use of tactics, which in the meantime allowed the CCP to build strong alliances. One of the most decisive battles of the war was the Battle of Huihai in 1948. It was here that the KMT suffered quite a significant defeat, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers either being killed or captured. The battle is often seen as the major turning point in the war, although you could argue that the events taking place that led up to this battle was just as important, because it clearly showed signs that there was going to be a major shift in the favour of the CCP. And then the final phase in the fall of the KMT takes place in 1949. The CCP started to launch in 1949 a series of offensives that would ultimately result in the rapid collapse of the KMT forces. The nationalist government was ultimately increasingly unable to hold those major cities including Beijing and Ningjiang, and later they fell to the communists in April 1949. And so by autumn of 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and the remaining parts of the KMT government then fled to Taiwan. They established a rival government in Taiwan, and the CCP under Mao Zedong declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China in October 1949, marking the first official victory of the communists in the Civil War. The first and only, the Civil War's ultimate victory for the Chinese Communist Party. Now, the aftermath was quite significant then. And we'll talk about the aftermath in the next lesson as well in terms of the economy. But from a political perspective, we can see that the CCP's victory marks the end of quite a long period of political instability in China, at least dating back as far as the beginnings of the Sino-Japanese War in 1937, but maybe even going back even further still. Mao Zedong's leadership and the Communist Party's control of the countryside were key to their success. Ultimately, the peasantry within the Chinese population became disillusioned with the nationalist government. The creation of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, was a major event in Chinese history. Mao Zedong becomes the head of state, and a communist party begins to assume full control over the country, with the nationalists retreating to Taiwan. Now, we do start to see political repression, and I'm going to leave the point on political repression for a future lesson, because we'll get to that in far more detail there. I'm also going to brush over quite quickly the economic impact of this conflict and of the Sino-Japanese War, because again, that is something that we're going to explore in quite a lot of detail throughout the next series of lessons. Ultimately, what you can sort of glean from this slide is that there was economic devastation. The economy was left in ruins. One of the most important policies for the communists at the time was land reform. We'll start to see the implementation of massive land redistribution processes, aiming to break up large estates owned by landlords. We do also see Soviet support. They received significant support from the Soviet Union. This included military aid, economic assistance, and technical expertise. And then finally, we can see the ultimate social and cultural consequences. The CCP began to implement socialist policies aimed to transform Chinese society. So we can see, for example, collectivization of agriculture, nationalization of industries, and the introduction of a state-run education and healthcare system. We'll talk about education and healthcare towards the end of this course, but ultimately these things paved the way for the consolidation of power for Mao Zedong and set the stage for more radical policies, including things like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution in the 60s and 70s, more of which will be discussed in future videos.